For 30 years, they knew. 30 years of cholera outbreaks. 30 years of mass graves in the East End. 30 years of petitions, investigations, reports, and evidence delivered directly to the most powerful legislative body on earth. Between 1831 and 1866, approximately 40,000 people died from cholera in London alone. 40,000 people. And Parliament did not act. Then, in the summer of 1858, the smell from the Thames reached their windows. Within 18 days, a bill was created, passed, and signed into law. 18 days. Not 18 months, not 18 years. 18 days, after 30 years of silence. As the Times observed, their proximity to the source of the stench had concentrated their attention on its causes in a way that many years of argument and campaigning had failed to do. This is the story the Victorian era does not want to tell about itself. Not the Crystal Palace, not the railways, not the silk gowns and the gas lamps and the confident march of civilization. The real story is simpler and far darker. It is the story of a society that looked at 40,000 dead and called it an unfortunate problem, and looked at an unpleasant smell, its own smell, and called it an emergency. The difference between those two reactions was not science. It was not ignorance. It was not the slow turning of history's wheels. It was a postcode. This is not a story history wanted you to know. In the summer of 1858, the British Parliament, the most powerful legislative body on earth, was brought to a complete standstill. Not by war, not by revolution, by smell. The River Thames, running directly beneath the windows of the newly rebuilt Houses of Parliament, had become an open sewer. The heat that summer was extraordinary, temperatures in the shade reaching over 34 degrees Celsius for weeks on end. The river level dropped, and what remained on its banks was centuries of accumulated human waste, industrial runoff, and rot baking in the sun. Members of Parliament could not work. Some were seen fleeing the chamber with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. The intense heat had driven legislators from those portions of the building which overlooked the river. The curtains of Parliament were soaked in chloride of lime in a desperate attempt to mask the odor. When that failed, there was serious discussion about abandoning the building entirely. Within just 18 days, Parliament approved the full funding for an entirely new sewage infrastructure for the City of London. 18 days. Here is what makes that number so strange. In the decades before that summer, cholera had swept through London 4 separate times. The 1832 outbreak alone killed an estimated 32,000 people across Britain. The epidemic of 1848 killed over 14,000 in London in a single year. Then came 1854, when more than 500 people died in the Soho neighborhood within 10 days. Each time, the poor buried their dead. Each time, Parliament debated. And each time, nothing changed. During the outbreaks of
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
1848 and 1854, the mortality rate from cholera was 25 times higher in working-class districts like Rotherhithe than in the wealthy area of Hampstead. 25 times. The disease knew exactly where it was welcome and where it was not. For nearly 30 years, tens of thousands died. Petitions were filed. Investigations were commissioned. Reports were published. The science was increasingly clear. And Parliament did nothing. Then, in the summer of 1858, the smell reached their windows. And in 18 days, the money was approved. Think about that for a moment. What exactly was Parliament waiting for? Everything in that story is technically true, but technically true is not the same as honest. Here is what history taught most of us about the Victorian era. Britain, in the second half of the 19th century, was the most advanced civilization the world had ever seen. The steam engine had remade the continent. Railways sliced through countryside that had barely changed since the Middle Ages. Factories produced more in a single year than entire kingdoms had produced in centuries. And at the center of it all was London, the capital of an empire so vast that, as its citizens proudly declared, the sun never set upon it. In 1851, Prince Albert organized what became the defining symbol of this age, the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of all nations. Over 100,000 products from all four corners of the world were housed in a giant glass building in Hyde Park, open to everyone, from all classes and all nationalities. The Australian Museum. The building itself, a cathedral of iron and glass, tall enough to enclose full-grown elm trees, was called the Crystal Palace. 6 million people walked through its doors, a third of Britain's entire population. Queen Victoria visited 34 times. She described it as the greatest day in our history. And it is easy to understand why. The exhibition was not just a trade fair, it was a statement, a declaration that humanity had arrived somewhere new, that science, industry, and moral progress had converged, and Britain stood at their peak. This is the Victorian era most of us learned about, the era of Dickens and Darwin, of Brunel's railways and Florence Nightingale's hospitals, of manners so elaborate they required entire books of instruction, and ballrooms where women in silk gowns waltzed under chandeliers while their husbands discussed the expansion of empire. Industrial prosperity had produced a social order that equated wealth with virtue and respectability with righteousness. School history. To be Victorian was to believe in progress, to believe that civilization was not merely an idea, it was a direction, and Britain was leading the way. That is the story most people carry with them. The Crystal Palace, the railways, the empire. The extraordinary confidence of a society that genuinely believed it was making the world better. And in many ways, it was. The numbers did improve. Lifespans lengthened. Literacy spread. New institutions were built. The 19th century was one of rapid development and change, far swifter than in previous centuries. But here is the detail that tends to get left out of the story. In 1851, the very same year Queen Victoria stood inside the Crystal Palace and declared it the greatest day in the history of civilization, the average life expectancy for a working-class man in the East End of London, just 4 miles from Hyde Park, was under 30 years. 4 miles away, the same city, the same year, a completely different world. The version that fills the history books is technically accurate. But technically accurate is not the same thing as complete. Everything in that story is technically true, but technically true is not the same as honest. In 1854, a physician named John Snow did something that had never been done before. He drew a map. Using the addresses of the people who had died during the Soho cholera outbreak, he began to plot the cases on paper. Each black bar represented a death. Street by street, building by building, the pattern that emerged was impossible to ignore. The deaths clustered with extraordinary precision around a single water pump on Broad Street. Snow had already suspected the truth for years. As early as 1849, he had published a detailed essay arguing that cholera was not spread through foul air, as almost everyone believed, but through contaminated water. The essay had landed in near-complete silence. The medical establishment ignored it. The government ignored it. And the disease kept killing. Now, in 1854, with over 500 dead in 10 days, Snow had his proof. He had even found a near-perfect control group inside the outbreak itself. None of the workers at the Broad Street Brewery had contracted cholera. They received a daily allowance of beer, never drank the pump water, and any water used in their brewing process was boiled, inadvertently killing the bacteria before it could reach them. School history. The infected and the healthy were living on the same street.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
The only difference was the water. On the 7th of September, Snow walked into the offices of the local parish authorities and presented his findings. He had his map. He had his data. He had his control group. He was not believed. Not a single member of his own profession believed him. Not one individual in the parish believed him. History skills. Still, under pressure, they agreed to a compromise. They removed the handle from the pump, not because they accepted his theory, but as a precaution. An experiment, they called it. The outbreak subsided. And yet, even then, the official scientific committee tasked with investigating the epidemic could not bring itself to endorse Snow's conclusion. Their final report read, "Either in air or water, it seems probable that the infection can grow," admitting barely any ground to Snow's findings at all. History skills. The man had just demonstrated, with meticulous evidence, exactly how cholera spread and exactly how to stop it. He had saved an unknowable number of lives with a map and a removed pump handle. And the official position was, maybe air, maybe water. Who can say? Snow died in June 1858 at the age of 45, convinced beyond doubt that his theory was correct, but with little expectation that he would receive any credit for it. Britain's Best Guides. He died that same summer, the summer of the Great Stink, the summer Parliament finally acted. He never saw it happen. And here is the crack in the Victorian story of progress. This was not a failure of knowledge. The knowledge existed. It had been published, mapped, demonstrated, and delivered directly to the people with the power to act. The delay was not ignorance. What happened next was not an accident. 3 pieces of evidence. Each one alone is interesting. Together, they are impossible to ignore. Here is the first piece of the puzzle. When Joseph Bazalgette was commissioned to build London's new sewer system after the Great Stink of 1858, his design was celebrated as a masterpiece of modern engineering. Newspapers praised it. Politicians invoked it as proof of Victorian genius. Historians still cite it as one of the great public health achievements of the 19th century. And in many ways, it was. But look at the engineering plans more carefully. The actual routing decisions, the sequencing, the priorities. And a different story emerges. The core design values of the new infrastructure were explicit: to protect the health of the laboring workforce, and to secure the lifestyle of wealthy people. Rich neighborhoods received sewer connections first, and the business of building those sewers became a lucrative investment opportunity for the upper classes. Victorian monsters. The people who had created the crisis were now profiting from solving it. In Birmingham, the pattern was identical. Wealthy suburbs were connected to sewers in the 1850s, while working-class neighborhoods had to wait until the 1870s and 1880s. Victorian monsters. A gap of 2 full decades. While aristocrats enjoyed plumbed bathrooms with the classic Victorian chain-pull cistern, some homes with multiple water closets, including separate facilities for servants, families in the working-class districts were still using overflowing cesspools. Keep that in mind. We will come back to it. Now consider what was happening at the same time on the other side of the city. While the new sewers were being built and being routed to protect wealthy neighborhoods first, the treatment works at Beckton and Crossness were not actually treating anything. They were simply discharge points, releasing raw sewage into the Thames further downstream at the ebb of the tide, blighting many working-class residents of East London. The sewage had not been eliminated. It had been moved downstream, away from Parliament, away from the West End, away from the neighborhoods where decisions were made and money lived, and directly toward the communities least equipped to fight back. And this is where it gets interesting. Most well-off Victorians were either genuinely ignorant of slum life or chose to pretend they were. Many who did hear about it believed the slums were simply the outcome of laziness, sin, and vice among the lower classes. Pathological Bodies Project Poverty was not seen as a structural problem. It was seen as a moral one, which made it very easy to look away. The infrastructure itself encoded that logic, built to protect some, built to redirect consequence toward others, not out of malice, or not only out of malice, out of the deep, unquestioned assumption that this was simply the natural order of things. Now here is the part that changes the entire picture. The sewer system built after 1858, the one hailed as a triumph of civilization, is still there. Not as a museum piece, still in use. The UK's current sewage system is largely the same infrastructure built during the Victorian period. The same pipes, in many places, the same bricks. The same combined design that mixes rainwater and sewage, which means that during heavy rainfall, the overflow goes directly into rivers. When first implemented in the 1850s, London's system was designed to discharge overflow for around 12 days a year. Today, that number exceeds 60 days annually. 60 days a year of raw sewage entering the waterways. And the costs, as ever, fall disproportionately on the poor. The Victorian era did not just leave behind a sewage problem, it left behind a decision. A decision about whose comfort matters, whose health gets protected first, whose neighborhood bears the overflow. That decision was made in 1858. It has never been reversed. This is not just a story about the past. It is a blueprint, and it is still being used. Here is what believing the Victorian story of progress actually cost us. In 1989, Margaret Thatcher's government privatized England's water industry. The promise was efficiency, investment, better services. The logic was distinctly Victorian in spirit, that private enterprise, driven by competition and self-interest, would naturally produce better outcomes for everyone. What actually happened is that private water companies prioritized profits and shareholder dividends over long-term improvements. As Britain's decrepit Victorian-era infrastructure languished, water company executives received six-figure bonuses, while shareholders collected tens of billions of pounds in payouts. Science Museum. The pipes beneath the streets, the same Victorian-era pipes, were left to decay. Nobody questioned this. For over 100 years, nobody questioned this. By 2023, privatized water companies in England were carrying an estimated £56 billion in debt, while having paid out £76 billion in shareholder dividends since privatization. Read that again. More money extracted in dividends than the entire debt they accumulated. And the infrastructure still crumbling underneath. In 2023, sewage spills into England's waterways more than doubled, rising from 1.75 million hours to 3.6 million hours in a single year. The number of individual spills soared by 54%. The same rivers, the same logic, the same overflow being redirected toward the places least equipped to fight back. And here is where the Victorian parallel becomes impossible to ignore. The English water industry is now over 70% foreign-owned, by investment firms, private equity funds, pension funds, and businesses lodged in tax havens spread across 17 countries. School history. The profits flow outward, across oceans, to shareholders who will never swim in the rivers their companies are polluting. The irony is almost too obvious. Almost. In Victorian London, the wealthy lived upstream. The poor lived downstream. The sewage, once redirected, became someone else's problem. Specifically, the problem of those with the least power to object. That was not an accident of geography. It was a design choice. And the design was never dismantled. It was privatized. Justice principles, distributive, procedural, recognition, remain weakly embedded in English water infrastructure planning to this day. The economic and environmental costs of maintaining infrastructure and managing pollution fall most heavily on vulnerable communities, while private shareholders capture substantial dividends. Hartford Stage. The Victorian era taught an entire civilization to see this arrangement as natural, as inevitable, as simply the way things work. And that belief, more than any pipe, more than any pump, is the infrastructure that has proven hardest to replace. We did not inherit a sewage problem. We inherited a story about who the sewage belongs to. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, it is rhyming very loudly. Here is what the Victorian era really left behind. Not the railways, not the Crystal Palace, not even the sewers. It left behind a way of thinking, a way of organizing society that dressed itself in the language of progress, civilization, and moral order, while quietly encoding into the very pipes beneath the streets the assumption that some lives matter more than others, that the discomfort of the powerful is an emergency, that the suffering of the powerless is a structural inevitability. This is the inheritance that most history books do not discuss, because the history books were written by people who benefited from it. Jon Snow died without recognition. The thousands who filled the cholera pits of the East End died without being counted as a political failure. The letter written by the desperate residents of the slums, barely literate, full of spelling errors, describing lives lived in muck and filth, sat in an archive for a century and a half before anyone thought to make it famous. And the infrastructure those people were begging for, the basic dignity of clean water and a functioning sewer, was eventually built. But built to serve the wealthy first. Built so that its overflow could be quietly redirected toward the neighborhoods that history had already decided mattered less. We look at the Victorian era and we see a world that is far away from us. Corsets and carriages, gas lamps and empire. Something safely historical, contained behind glass in a museum. But the pipes are still there. The logic is still there. On the surface, it makes sense. But surfaces are rarely the whole story. The real question the Victorian era asks us, if we are honest enough to let it, is not how they could have been so blind. It is how much of our own blindness is structural. How many of the crises we are slow to solve are slow precisely because the people suffering from them are not the people with the power to speed things up. How many of our 18-day decisions are still waiting for the smell to reach the right windows? That is worth sitting with. If history got this wrong for this long, if it took the smell reaching Parliament's windows for anyone to act, what are we still waiting to smell today? Tell me in the comments. Next week, we uncover how 19 people were hanged not for what they believed, but for what they owned. The Victorian era gave the world the Crystal Palace and kept the sewage for everyone else. The real lesson of the Victorian era is not about filth. It is about us and the infrastructure those people were begging for. The basic dignity of clean water and a functioning sewer was eventually built. But built to serve the wealthy first. Built so that its overflow could be quietly redirected toward the neighborhoods that history had already decided mattered less. We look at the Victorian era and we see a world that is far away from us. Corsets and carriages, gas lamps and empire. Something safely historical, contained behind glass in a museum. But the pipes are still there. The logic is still there. On the surface, it makes sense. But surfaces are rarely the whole story. The real question the Victorian era asks us, if we are honest enough to let it, is not how they could have been so blind. It is how much of our own blindness is structural. How many of the crises we are slow to solve are slow precisely because the people suffering from them are not the people with the power to speed things up. How many of our 18-day decisions are still waiting for the smell to reach the right windows? That is worth sitting with. If history got this wrong for this long, if it took the smell reaching Parliament's windows for anyone to act, what are we still waiting to smell today? Tell me in the comments. Next week, we uncover how 19 people were hanged not for what they believed, but for what they owned. The Victorian era gave the world the Crystal Palace and kept the sewage for everyone else. The real lesson of the Victorian era is not about filth. It is about us, a way of organizing society that dressed itself in the language of progress, civilization, and moral order, while quietly encoding into the very pipes beneath the streets the assumption that some lives matter more than others, that the discomfort of the powerful is an emergency, that the suffering of the powerless is a structural inevitability. This is the inheritance that most history books do not discuss, because the history books were written by people who benefited from it. Jon Snow died without recognition. The thousands who filled the cholera pits of the East End died without being counted as a political failure. The letter written by the desperate residents of the slums, barely literate, full of spelling errors, describing lives lived in muck and filth, sat in an archive for a century and a half before anyone thought to make it famous.